Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is going to be helping me out with the voiceover today, so everyone give him a warm welcome.
Number 10. Emperor Commodus. Roman emperors were by far some of the most brutal dictators in the history of human society. But one of the absolute worst was Roman Emperor Commodus, the man who'd eat his dinner off the hunched backs of his own slaves. It was extremely common in ancient Rome for elite households to have servants around. But Commodus took things to a whole new level of depravity by keeping disabled slaves in his palace. Whenever he'd hold a feast, he would order 2 of his slaves with hunchbacks to bend over in front of him so he could use them as a living table. That wasn't the only sick thing he did at dinner either. He would have other male slaves strip naked, position themselves on all fours, and have their backs covered in mustard so his guests could eat off them. Emperor Commodus took his dictatorial lifestyle very seriously. Not only was he madly in love with his own sister, but he then had her killed when she conspired against him. He also had a fascination with gladiator battles, which he paired with his fascination for disabled slaves. He would often fight in the arena as a gladiator against disabled people. But that's not even the worst part, because the citizens of Rome would pay huge amounts of money to watch him do it. The emperor also fought animals in the arena for the satisfaction of the Roman people. Historian Edward Gibbon says the emperor once slayed 100 lions in a single day, though not with his bare hands. He would apparently stand on an elevated platform and shoot at them with a bow. And now for number 9. But first, it's shout-out time. I wanted to say a big thank you to Shay Turner and Sizzler Kalonji for supporting this channel. We love hearing from you and being a part of your day. If you're new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button to join the Origins Explained family. Number 9. Curious Omens. Roman traditions were exceptionally strange, especially when it came to their superstitions. Romans believed in some of the most insane superstitions that you've never heard of. For example, the Romans believed that if you kissed a female mule on the nostrils, it would cure your hiccups immediately. And seeing an owl meant that something bad was going to happen soon. But if you saw a bee, that could cancel out the bad omen from the owl. The one thing that's for sure is that Romans were convinced nothing happened without a reason. Everything in life had meaning, and if you looked hard enough, there was always a sign of what was to come. By taking a specific herb growing near the head of a statue and wrapping it around your neck, Romans thought you could cure headaches. There were even professionals who practiced haruspicy, the art of studying the liver of a sacrificed animal to see somebody's fortune. Romans also believed the left side of the bed was evil. That's why we still say getting up on the right side of the bed, because Romans thought waking up on the left side of the bed could bring disaster in the days to come. Apparently, it was also bad luck to enter a house with your left foot first. Roman nobles would hire people known as footmen to ensure everyone who entered their house did so with the right foot first. And of course, a broken mirror meant 7 years of bad luck. Number 8. Saturnalia. Saturnalia was an ancient pagan festival that was held in Rome for centuries to honor the agricultural god Saturn. Historians have suggested Saturnalia may have been the origin of Christmas. The celebration was held every year near the winter solstice and often included the giving of gifts, great feasting, and huge wreaths decorated the doors of Roman households. It was a jolly celebration that evolved from even more ancient midwinter festivals. The older primeval festivals typically included blood sacrifices and gifts to the harvest gods for a bountiful sowing season. Saturnalia began with a celebration on a single day. It was all about the Roman god of agriculture and time. However, during the days of the late Republic, sometime prior to 31 BC, the festival evolved into an entire week of celebration. The festivities happened to peak at the winter solstice on December 25th. Schools were closed, businesses came to a halt, and all ordinary functions ceased. For an entire week, Romans decorated their homes in greenery. They wore colorful togas, and they even let slaves take a bit of a break. In some cases, slaves were even allowed to sit at the head of the table and be served by their masters. There was gambling, singing, and lots of gifts. Wax taper candles were particularly common because the candles represented light returning to the world after the solstice. To be honest, Saturnalia wasn't that messed up at all. On the contrary, it was largely responsible for your much-anticipated Christmas break every year. It was the jolliest holiday in all of the Roman Empire. The sickest part was that the Romans often gave each other small terracotta figurines as gifts. These were called Saturnalia. They were a throwback to the earlier celebrations where Romans performed sacrifices and likely covered themselves in human blood. Number 7. Dwarf Gladiators. One of the most messed up ancient traditions was rounding up a group of dwarfs, meaning people of small stature, and making them fight in the arena. Emperor Commodus was notorious for slaying crippled people and those with disabilities, but this was something completely different. Dwarves would often be taken against their will and would either be forced to reenact stage plays from mythology or fight to the applause of the bloodthirsty crowd. Sometimes dwarves would even be pitted against women because Romans figured it was a fair fight. Romans loved a good spectacle, and the weirder the better. Although the dwarves were frequently used in the arena, they likely weren't forced to fight to the death all that much. Finding extremely short people wasn't an easy task in ancient Rome, so they couldn't be easily replaced. Anyone with unusual proportions was transformed into a visual spectacle in front of the public instead of being slaughtered. There were things like dwarf tossing, where ordinary-sized people would throw dwarfs as far as they could, something similar to the shot put in modern-day track and field events. Believe it or not, the tradition of dwarf tossing continued until just recently. Surprisingly, this practice was popular in Canada until it was banned in 2003. As much as people want to point fingers at the Romans and call them cruel for what they did, it's fair to say if the Colosseum was put back into action today, tickets would definitely be sold out. Number 6. Torabolium. Torabolium was an ancient rite practiced by Romans starting around 2,000 years ago. The practice reached its peak in the Mediterranean cult scene around the year 160 AD. This was less than a century after the death of Christ, and Christianity hadn't yet become the dominant religion. People still worshipped the old gods and gave sacrifices to the mother gods of Rome. This particular ceremony was so popular that historians believe it was most likely introduced to the masses by a Roman emperor. But even though it was extremely popular at first, it quickly began to change. And by the time Christianity was taking over in the 3rd century AD, the practice was almost gone. Most people nowadays would consider Torabolium disgusting. To complete this ritual, a person would lie in a sacrificial pit. A perforated board would then be placed over the opening of the pit, basically a chunk of wood with holes drilled into it. And afterward, a bull would be slaughtered above the pit so that the person inside could bathe in the bull's blood as it seeped through the holes in the wood. The entire purpose of the ceremony was to offer a sacrifice to a specific god or goddess, but the individual bathing in the bull's blood would also receive a divine blessing. With the rise of Christianity, Torabolium became more like a ritual of purification. It may have even evolved into what we know today as baptisms. Number 5. Roman slavery. The most messed up tradition in ancient Rome was slavery by far, no question about it. The Romans were notorious slavers, and they didn't care what the person's color was, where they came from, or any natural-born rights they may have thought they had. In Rome and throughout all the cities belonging to the Roman Empire, enslaved people played a significant role in society. They were in the major cities and the countryside, and these slaves weren't just reserved for the elite either. Ordinary citizens of Rome, as long as they could prove they were Roman, could have their own slaves. These servants could come from anywhere outside the Roman Empire, or they could come from newly acquired lands. When Rome took somewhere over, they also subjugated the people and often turned them into pieces of property. These people had no rights, meaning they could be treated however their owner wished, up until their death, of course. In Rome and North Africa in particular, it was popular for slaves to wear metal collars. Archaeologists recently uncovered a tag from the 4th century AD that was once attached to a metal collar. It had a Latin inscription stamped on it that said, "Hold me lest I flee, and return me to my master." This was the Roman version of a dog collar, giving the name and address of the slave's master. If you think the collars were bad, just wait until you learn why they were used in the first place. The Roman metal collars came into play following a law passed down by Emperor Constantine in 316 AD. Constantine had previously banned the cruel practice of tattooing a slave's forehead, and so slave owners began using metal collars around their servants' throats instead. Number 4. Infanticide. For most of human existence, infanticide was a common practice. In ancient Rome, they didn't have reliable means of contraception, which meant they weren't that skillful at preventing pregnancies. And so, when an unwanted baby arrived in the world, Romans would often throw them in the sewer. As horrific as that is for us today, it was widely accepted in the Roman Empire. Well, maybe not widely accepted. Simon Mays from the Ancient Monuments Laboratory of English Heritage says it was likely more tolerated than accepted. However, Simon says it's difficult to say for sure. Take for example a recent excavation that was carried out at an old villa in Buckinghamshire, England. The villa was in use between the 1st and 4th century AD throughout a huge stretch of the Roman Empire. Excavations in 1921 revealed 97 infant burials. This was the largest infant graveyard that had ever been found in Roman Britain. The babies were likely the victims of mass infanticide. There's another location at the ancient city of Ashkelon, Israel, where archaeologists found the bones of almost 100 infants that had been cast into a sewer underneath a brothel. The implications here are obvious. Maybe people of high society didn't throw away their babies, but during the days of the empire, people who didn't want or couldn't afford new children often threw them into the sewers. Number 3. Public executions. Romans were big fans of public executions. When somebody was charged with a crime and sentenced to die, the more humiliating and degrading it was to the criminal, the better for the spectators. Criminals, male or female, were often brought into the arena and then publicly executed in the worst ways imaginable. They were almost always brought to the arena nude, and then came the pain. Crucifixion was one way a person could die. Another sentence was death by sword, meaning the prisoner would be slain by an armed gladiator. One of the most popular methods, however, was putting somebody in a net so they couldn't escape, suspending them in the air, and then letting a bull loose in the arena so that it would attack the criminal. The victim would be flung around and stomped on by the bull until their eventual death. Sometimes women would be tied to the horns of the bull and then gored. On other occasions, an elephant would be unleashed in the theater to stomp them to death. This was most often reserved for those charged with being traitors to the empire, and sometimes an execution could be as simple as someone being lit on fire in front of thousands of eager spectators. Number 2. Decimation. The Roman army took desertion very seriously. One of the reasons Rome was able to expand all the way to Britain in the west and Asia in the east was because their army was severely disciplined. When Roman legionaries fled a battle or disobeyed a leader's command, they were given one of the cruelest punishments ever conceived by a military force. It was called decimation, and it helped Roman legions keep their soldiers in line. It didn't matter how many soldiers disobeyed, because even if it was just one individual, the entire unit was punished. The unit would be divided into groups of 10 individuals. Then each group would draw straws. The person who drew the short straw would subsequently be beaten to death by their 9 comrades using brutal wooden clubs. As if bludgeoning your friend to death wasn't traumatic enough, the survivors were then banished from their legion for days and forced to live in the wild. Number 1. Vestal Virgins. In ancient Rome, Vestal Virgins were priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, the home, and the family. Vesta represented Rome's purity as a city. Sometime around 715 BC, the second known king of Rome, Numa Pompilius, established a special order of priestesses to ensure the goddess Vesta was always happy. But much of this is according to legend, so it's difficult to say exactly what happened. Rome is believed to have had 7 kings before the Republic was formed in the 5th century BC, though that's never been confirmed. All we know is that Vestal Virgins came into existence about 2,700 years ago, and the tradition continued long into the Roman Empire. Their only real duty was to keep the fire burning at the Temple of Vesta. The Vestal Virgins were seen as extremely lucky ladies. Any young girl who was chosen to be a priestess of Vesta was revered in her community. They would join as young girls and take a vow of chastity for 30 years. These women were considered sacred, and any attempt to harm or harass them was punishable by death. The absolute worst thing that could happen was for one of the Vestal priestesses to break her vow of chastity on purpose. When this happened, there was no choice but to kill the priestess. But since Romans weren't allowed to kill Vesta's servants, they would be lowered into a hole that would be sealed afterward. The priestesses would eventually die of starvation, which the Romans didn't consider an act of murder. What do you feel was the worst thing that the ancient Romans practiced? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel.